the silence in the delivery room was heavier than the air itself. Liam, a man with pale skin and blue eyes, looked down at the newborn resting on his wife's chest. The baby didn't just have a different complexion, she had deep, obsidian skin and tight, dark curls. Jessica, his blonde wife, wasn't looking at the child, she was staring at Liam with the wide, terrified eyes of a trapped animal. The doctors froze, the nurses averted their gaze, and the undeniable proof of her infidelity screamed louder than any confession. But Liam didn't yell. He didn't demand a DNA test. He didn't even cry. He simply smiled a cold, terrifying smile, turned his back on the family that never existed, and walked out the door, because he knew something about this moment that Jessica never saw coming. The morning sun flooded the penthouse on the 42nd floor, turning the cream-colored walls into a canvas of pure, blinding light. It was a Sunday, the kind that only exists in advertisements for high-end real estate or in the minds of those who have never known a day of want in their lives. The air smelled faintly of roasted Arabica beans and expensive linen, a scent that Liam had come to associate with the life he had meticulously built over the last 5 years. He stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light that fell across the hand-woven rug. Jessica sat in the rocking chair by the floor-to-ceiling window, a vision in white silk that seemed to glow against the backdrop of the waking city. Her hands, pale and delicate as porcelain, rested protectively over the heavy swell of her stomach, her fingers tracing slow, rhythmic circles against the fabric. She looked less like a woman about to give birth and more like a Renaissance painting brought to life, a serene Madonna waiting for her miracle to arrive. Liam felt a surge of protectiveness so intense it almost physically hurt, a tightening in his chest that made him want to shield her from the world. He crossed the room silently, his bare feet sinking into the plush carpet that had cost more than his first car. Placing his hands on her shoulders, he felt the tension in her neck, a subtle rigidity that contradicted her peaceful expression. Jessica leaned back into his touch, tilting her head so her blonde hair cascaded over his hands like spun gold. Her blue eyes, usually bright with laughter, held a strange, watery depth this morning, reflecting the sprawling park below them. She whispered that he was going to be the best father in the world, her voice trembling with an emotion he interpreted as pure joy. Their world was constructed on a foundation of perfect similarities and shared aesthetics. They were both from established New England families, both successful in their respective fields, and both possessed the kind of effortless, fair-skinned beauty that opened doors before they even knocked. They were the golden couple of their social circle, a seamless union of genetics and capital that everyone envied. Liam kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her vanilla shampoo, and told her that she was his angel, the only person who had ever truly understood him. He believed it with every fiber of his being. The tranquility shattered 3 hours later with a sharp gasp that cut through the quiet hum of the apartment. The cup of herbal tea Jessica had been holding slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor and sending a dark stain spreading across the pristine white stone. Panic flared in her eyes, a sudden, wild fear that seemed disproportionate to the natural progression of things. Liam moved instantly, his architect's brain switching to crisis management mode, grabbing the pre-packed bag and guiding her toward the elevator while she clutched his arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong and desperate. The drive to the private clinic was a blur of gray asphalt and the muffled roar of the city on a weekend. Liam drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding Jessica's, whose skin had turned the color of parchment. She was murmuring things he could not quite catch, fragments of sentences that sounded like apologies or prayers. He squeezed her hand reassuringly, telling her to breathe, promising that everything was going according to plan. He imagined their future child, a perfect synthesis of them both, a fair-haired boy or girl who would complete the picture they had spent years painting. The delivery room was a world of aggressive whiteness, from the blinding overhead lights to the starched sheets that covered Jessica's trembling body. The air was cold and smelled of antiseptic and steel, a sharp contrast to the warm vanilla scent of their home. Monitors beeped with a rhythmic, high-pitched urgency that seemed to count down the seconds to their new life. Liam stood by the head of the bed, wiping sweat from his wife's forehead, whispering words of encouragement as her face contorted in agony. She looked at him then, and for a second, he saw a flash of absolute terror that had nothing to do with physical pain. The labor was difficult and drawn out, a physical struggle that seemed to drain the very life force from the room. Doctors moved with practiced efficiency, their voices low and commanding, while nurses checked vitals and adjusted fluids. The tension in the room grew thicker with every passing minute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that made it hard to breathe. Finally, after what felt like days but was only hours, the doctor announced that the baby was coming. Liam leaned in, his heart hammering against his ribs, ready to welcome the heir to his perfect world. A final, guttural cry tore from Jessica's throat, followed by the wet, slick sound of new life entering the world. Then, silence. It was not the hushed reverence of a miracle, but the thick, viscous quiet of a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. The newborn did not cry immediately, and for a heartbeat, Liam feared the worst. But then the baby squirmed in the midwife's gloved hands, a living, breathing reality that defied every expectation and every assumption Liam had ever made. The midwife hesitated, her eyes darting quickly to the doctor before she lifted the child. The baby that was placed onto Jessica's heaving, pale chest was undeniably healthy, but the visual impact was like a physical blow to everyone in the room. The infant's skin was a deep, rich brown, a pigment so dark and distinct that it stood out against the white hospital linens like a drop of ink on snow. Tightly coiled black hair covered the small head, and the facial features, even in their newborn puffiness, spoke of a heritage that neither Liam nor Jessica possessed. It was a biological statement of fact that no amount of lighting or angle could explain away. Liam stood frozen, his hand still hovering in the air where he had been about to stroke the baby's cheek. His brain struggled to process the visual data, searching for a logical explanation where none existed. He looked at the child, then slowly lifted his gaze to his wife. Jessica did not look at the baby, she looked at him. Her face was drained of all color, her blue eyes wide and dark with the realization that the facade had not just cracked, but completely disintegrated. In that sterile, white room, the truth hung between them, heavy and undeniable, destroying the perfect life Liam thought he owned. Liam walked out of the delivery room with the mechanical precision of a man who had just been lobotomized. He did not speak to the sobbing woman in the bed, nor did he acknowledge the nurses who called after him with frantic, hushed voices. The corridor stretched out before him, a long tunnel of linoleum and fluorescent lights that seemed to vibrate with an aggressive, headache-inducing hum. Every step he took away from that room felt like he was severing a limb, a necessary amputation to prevent the gangrene of his reality from spreading to his heart. He stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the doors slide shut, sealing off the scene of his devastation. The drive away from the hospital was performed on autopilot, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. He did not go back to the penthouse. The idea of entering that space, with its nursery and its vanilla-scented air, induced a wave of nausea so potent he had to pull over. Instead, he checked into the St. Regis, securing a suite that smelled of impersonal luxury and lemon polish. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the wallpaper, waiting for the grief to hit him. But the grief did not come. Instead, a cold, crystalline rage began to form in his chest, sharp and heavy as a glacier. By the next morning, the shock had calcified into a singular purpose: he needed to know exactly how huge the lie was. He hired a private investigator recommended by his firm's legal department, a man who charged $500 an hour and promised total discretion. For 3 days, Liam lived in the hotel room, subsisting on room service and scotch, watching the city through the window with the detached gaze of a sniper. He did not answer his phone, which buzzed incessantly with calls from Jessica, her parents, and their mutual friends. He simply watched the lights of the city and waited for the dossier that would explain the destruction of his life. When the courier finally arrived with a thick manila envelope, Liam opened it with steady hands. The report was thorough, a forensic autopsy of his marriage that dated back 18 months. The man in the photographs was named Marcus Wright. He was a star investment banker at a rival firm, a man whose face had graced the covers of business magazines. As Liam spread the photos across the mahogany desk, he felt a new kind of humiliation burn through his veins. Marcus was everything Liam was not: 6 feet 4 inches of powerful, athletic muscle, with skin the color of deep obsidian and a smile that radiated arrogant charisma. The physical contrast was a deliberate insult, a biological statement that Jessica had sought out something diametrically opposed to her husband. Liam looked at his own reflection in the mirror, pale, wiry, intellectual, and realized that Jessica had not just cheated, she had fetishized a difference. She had sought out a primal opposite to their sterilized, white-bread existence. But the dossier held another piece of information, a detail that twisted the knife even deeper. Marcus Wright was not a bachelor. He was married, and his wife was a prominent figure in the downtown art scene. Her name was Nia Wright. The report described her as the owner of The Obsidian, a high-end gallery in Soho dedicated to contemporary African and diaspora art. Liam stared at her photograph. She was stunning, possessing a regal, almost intimidating beauty that seemed to demand respect even from a glossy 8x10 print. She stood tall and unsmiling at a gala, wearing a dress that looked like liquid gold against her dark skin. She looked like a queen who had no idea her king was a jester performing in another woman's court. Liam knew immediately what he had to do. He showered, shaved with meticulous care, and put on his most expensive charcoal suit. The cab ride to Soho felt like a journey into a foreign country. The neighborhood was vibrant, alive with tourists and the fashionable elite, a stark contrast to the grey, silent tomb of his hotel room. He found the gallery on a cobblestone street, its facade sleek and modern, with massive glass windows displaying vibrant, chaotic canvases that seemed to pulse with energy. He stood outside for a moment, watching the patrons inside, feeling like a ghost haunting the living. Then, he pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into the climate-controlled air, the smell of oil paint and expensive perfume filling his lungs. The interior of the gallery was a sensory explosion. The walls were painted a deep, matte charcoal, making the vibrant colors of the artwork pop with hallucinogenic intensity. Afrobeat jazz played softly in the background, a rhythmic undercurrent to the murmured conversations of the clientele. In the center of the room, directing a pair of assistants hanging a massive tapestry, stood Nia Wright. In person, she was even more imposing than in the photographs. She wore a structured white jumpsuit that emphasized her height and grace, her hair braided into an intricate crown atop her head. Liam waited until the assistants moved away before approaching her. He felt small, washed out, a specter of misery in this temple of culture and color. When she turned to face him, her expression was one of polite, professional inquiry, though her dark eyes flickered over his disheveled appearance and the hollow look in his sockets. He introduced himself, his voice rasping slightly from days of disuse. He saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, perhaps Marcus had mentioned him, or perhaps she simply recognized the look of a man carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He asked if they could speak privately, telling her it concerned her husband. The professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of wariness, before she nodded and led him toward a glass-walled office at the back of the gallery. The office was soundproof, cutting off the jazz and the chatter, creating a bubble of silence. She sat behind a desk made of reclaimed wood and gestured for him to sit. She did not offer him water or coffee. She simply waited, her posture perfect, her hands folded on the desk, bracing herself for whatever disaster this pale stranger was about to unleash. Liam did not waste time with pleasantries. He placed the manila envelope on the desk and slid it across to her. He watched her face as she opened it, saw the precise moment her world fractured. She pulled out the photographs, her eyes widening not with tears, but with a sudden, sharp intake of breath that sounded like a hiss. The photos were explicit, captured by the PI with ruthless clarity. They showed Marcus and Jessica in intimate embraces, laughing at cafes, entering hotels. They showed a black man and a white woman, a visual negative of the two people sitting in this office, engaged in a betrayal that felt targeted and specific. Nia stared at a photo of Marcus's hand resting possessively on Jessica's lower back, his dark skin stark against her pale dress. Her expression morphed from shock to a profound, nauseating disgust. It wasn't just the infidelity, it was the cliché of it. Liam could see the realization dawning on her, the same one that had choked him. Their spouses had not just stepped out, they had sought to escape the very essence of their partners. Jessica wanted the exotic strength of Marcus, Marcus wanted the trophy status of the blonde, blue-eyed Jessica. It was a betrayal compounded by racial dynamics that made them both feel inadequate in entirely different ways. She looked up at Liam, and for the first time, he saw the woman beneath the curator. Her eyes were pools of liquid pain, swimming with the same humiliation he felt. She did not scream or throw the photos. Instead, she closed the folder with a snap that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. She pressed her fingers to her temples, taking a deep, shuddering breath, fighting to maintain the composure that was clearly the armor she wore against the world. When she spoke, her voice was low and trembling with suppressed fury, asking him simply how long he had known. Liam told her about the hospital. He told her about the birth, the silence in the room, the child that was undeniable proof of the affair. As he spoke, he saw Nia's hand go to her own stomach, a subconscious gesture of empathy or perhaps relief that she was not the one left holding the physical consequence of the betrayal. The air between them shifted. They were no longer strangers, they were veterans of the same war, wounded by the same weapon. The contrast between them, his pallor against her richness, his rigid architect's suit against her flowing artistic attire, seemed to dissolve, replaced by the unifying frequency of their rage. She stood up and walked to the window of her office, looking out at the gallery floor where her life's work hung on the walls. She spoke to the glass, her back to him, saying that Marcus had always made her feel like she was too much, too intense, too black, too demanding. She said he used to joke about wanting a simpler life. Now she understood that simple meant a woman who existed as a blank canvas for his ego. Liam listened, feeling a strange, dark kinship forming. He told her that Jessica used to say he was too safe, too predictable. They had both been discarded for being exactly who they were. Nia turned back to him, and the vulnerability was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. She asked him what he intended to do. Liam admitted he hadn't thought beyond this moment, beyond the need to share the burden of the truth. Nia shook her head slowly, her earrings catching the light. She told him that truth was not enough. Truth was passive. They needed something more. She looked at the folder on her desk and then back at him, her eyes narrowing with calculation. She told him that Marcus was meticulous with his client's money but careless with his own secrets, and that she had access to things the private investigator could never find. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared reality settling around them. The noise of the gallery outside seemed miles away. Here, in this glass box, a new alliance was being forged. It wasn't born of friendship or attraction, but of a mutual need to balance the scales. Nia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper, and suggested they meet that evening, away from prying eyes. She knew a place. She said they needed to compare notes, to align their timelines, to understand the full scope of what had been done to them. Liam agreed without hesitation. As he looked at her, he realized that the despair he had felt in the hotel room was evaporating, replaced by a sense of direction. He was no longer just a victim of biology and deceit. He was a man with a partner. As he stood to leave, Nia extended her hand again. This time, when he took it, the shake was firm, a pact sealed in blood and ink. He walked out of the gallery and back into the sunlight of Soho, but the city no longer looked grey. It looked sharp, dangerous, and full of potential. He had walked in as a broken husband, he walked out as a conspirator. The meetings began as a necessity, a tactical alignment of two generals surveying a battlefield that had already been decimated by enemy fire. They chose a boutique hotel in Chelsea, a place of discreet luxury where the doormen were paid to have amnesia and the corridors were lined with sound-dampening velvet. It became their situation room, a neutral zone existing outside the coordinates of their crumbling domestic lives. 3 times a week, they would converge in a corner suite, transforming the mahogany writing desk into a command center cluttered with bank statements, printed emails, and the timeline of deceit they were meticulously constructing. At first, the air in the room was sterile, filled only with the rustle of paper and the low, angry hum of their voices as they catalogued the indignities inflicted upon them. But as the days bled into weeks, the atmosphere in the room began to shift, thickening with a humidity that had nothing to do with the New York summer. It started with the shared glances across the table, moments when the weight of the betrayal became too heavy to vocalize, and they would simply look at each other in a silence that felt louder than screaming. Liam found himself noticing the way the lamp light caught the bronze undertones of Nia's skin, the way her formidable posture softened as the evening wore on, revealing the exhaustion beneath the armor. Nia, in turn, seemed to be studying him, her dark eyes tracking the movement of his hands as he highlighted rows of numbers, perhaps reassessing the men her husband had dismissed as a non-entity. The shift from co-conspirators to something far more dangerous happened on a Tuesday, a night of torrential rain that battered the hotel windows and turned the city into a blurred watercolor. They were reviewing a credit card statement that showed Marcus had purchased a diamond bracelet for Jessica, a piece of jewelry Liam recognized from a recent business dinner his wife had attended. The sheer audacity of it, the financial cuckoldry using marital funds, snapped something inside Liam. He stood up, pacing the small room like a caged animal, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to process the image of his wife wearing diamonds bought with another woman's money, gifted by a man who laughed at them both. Nia remained seated, but her stillness was vibrating with kinetic energy. She watched him pace, her expression unreadable, until she finally stood and intercepted his path. When she reached out to stop him, placing her hands on his chest to steady him, the contact was not comforting, it was incendiary. It was as if the rage that had been building in both of them for weeks suddenly found a conduit, a grounding wire that connected their separate griefs. Liam looked down at her, his hands covering hers, and in that moment, the intellectual architecture of their revenge collapsed, replaced by a primal, desperate need to feel something other than loss. The kiss was not tentative. It was a collision, a violent reclamation of the passion their spouses had stolen from them. There was no romance in it, at least not in the traditional sense. It was an act of rebellion, a mutual decision to stop being the victims in someone else's narrative. They stumbled toward the bed, shedding the clothes of their respective roles, the architect's stiff collar, the curator's structured silk, until they were just skin and nerve endings. In the dim, amber light of the hotel room, the visual contrast between them became a symphony of light and shadow that was almost hypnotic in its intensity. Liam had spent 5 years worshipping at the altar of sameness, loving a woman who was his mirror image in tone and background. But here, in the shadows of this secret room, he was discovering the intoxicating power of the opposite. His pale hands moving over Nia's dark, velvety skin created a visual shock that was deeply, disturbingly erotic. It was a tableau of stark differences, his angular, wiry strength against her curved, statuesque power, the coolness of his complexion against the deep, radiating warmth of hers. It felt transgressive in the most necessary way, a deliberate rejection of the pure, aesthetic Jessica had prized so highly. For Nia, the experience was a revelation of a different kind. Marcus had always been a force of nature, a man who took up all the oxygen in the room, whose lovemaking was a performance of dominance and ego. With Liam, there was a focused intensity, a desperate attentiveness that made her feel seen rather than just conquered. He touched her with a kind of reverence she hadn't realized she was starving for, his hands mapping her body as if he were trying to memorize a new language. It was a connection born of shared trauma, yes, but it was evolving into a unique chemistry that neither of them could have predicted or prevented. The sex was urgent, fueled by a cocktail of anger, sorrow, and a sudden, overwhelming attraction. It was a way to scream without making a sound, to assert their existence in a world that had tried to erase them. When the storm finally broke, leaving them tangled in the high thread count sheets, the silence that followed was no longer heavy with tension. It was the quiet of a sanctuary. They lay side by side, the adrenaline fading into a dull, heavy ache, but for the first time since the hospital, Liam didn't feel the crushing weight of his own inadequacy. He felt anchored. Nia turned on her side, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him. Her braids cascaded over her shoulder, brushing against his chest, the dark locks stark against his white skin. She traced a line down his sternum with a manicured finger, her touch light but possessive. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were open and searching, looking for the men beneath the wreckage. She told him, her voice a low murmur in the semi-darkness, that Marcus had always mocked men like him. She said her husband believed that white men were soft, that they lacked the fire and the spine to hold onto a woman like Jessica, that they were easy to rob because they were too polite to fight back. The words hung in the air, a toxic echo of Marcus's arrogance. Liam felt a cold flush of humiliation, but it was quickly overtaken by a surge of icy determination. He caught Nia's hand, stopping her movement, and brought her dark fingers to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, not gently, but with a deliberate, searing pressure. Looking directly into her eyes, he made a promise that had nothing to do with legal proceedings or financial settlements. He told her that Marcus's underestimation was their greatest asset, and that he would use that very perception of softness to lure Marcus into a trap from which he would never escape. He promised her that he would destroy Marcus using the very methods the banker prided himself on: patience, calculation, and ruthlessness. He would not fight like a brute, he would dismantle Marcus's life brick by brick, using the blueprint of his own arrogance against him. Nia watched him, her eyes widening slightly as she saw the transformation in his face. The broken husband was gone. In his place was a man who had found his edge. She smiled then, a slow, dangerous expression that matched the cold fire in his eyes. She kissed him again, and this time, it wasn't out of desperation. It was a seal on a blood pact. This new intimacy changed the texture of their alliance. They were no longer just two injured parties comparing notes, they were a unit, a binary star system orbiting a black hole of vengeance. The connection between them became a secret weapon, a source of strength that their spouses could never anticipate because it defied the racial and social logic of their world. Marcus and Jessica believed they had crossed a line to find excitement. They had no idea that the people they left behind had crossed a far more dangerous line to find power. The contrast that the cheaters had fetishized was now the engine of their destruction. They spent the rest of the night not in sleep, but in a renewed frenzy of planning. But now, the planning was infused with a terrifying synergy. Nia knew Marcus's psychological triggers, his insecurities, the way he needed to feel superior to function. Liam knew how to build structures that looked sound but were designed to collapse under specific stress. Together, they began to draft a new strategy, one that utilized their relationship not just as a comfort, but as the ultimate blind spot. They would hide in plain sight, concealed by the very prejudices their spouses held against them. As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, they dressed in silence. There was no awkwardness, no morning after regret. They helped each other straighten collars and smooth down hair, intimate gestures of a couple who had gone to war together. When they left the hotel, exiting separately to avoid suspicion, Liam walked out into the cool morning air feeling a strange sense of wholeness. He touched his lip where Nia had bitten him, a lingering throb that served as a reminder, he was not weak. He had simply been saving his strength for a battle that actually mattered. The phone vibrating against the glass surface of the coffee table sounded less like a notification and more like a drill boring into Liam's skull. For 3 days, Jessica had been conducting a digital siege, a relentless bombardment of texts, voicemails, and links to dubious medical journals. Liam sat in the darkened living area of the hotel suite, watching the screen light up with yet another message, his face bathed in the cold, blue glow of the display. He did not pick it up immediately, he let it buzz, a rhythmic reminder of the chaos waiting for him outside this sanctuary. When the screen finally went dark, he reached for it with the caution one might use to handle a live grenade, swiping open the notification to read the latest chapter in her desperate fiction. It happens, Liam. It's called atavism. I found an article about a couple in the UK, 2 white parents, brown baby. It's a dormant gene skipping generations. Please, you have to stop punishing me for a miracle. The text was followed by a link to a tabloid website that looked about as scientifically rigorous as a horoscope. Liam read the words, feeling a dry, dusty laugh catch in his throat. The audacity was breathtaking. She wasn't just lying to him, she was insulting his intelligence, banking on the idea that his love for her was a form of blindness that would obscure even the laws of biology. She was constructing a reality where she was the victim of a genetic anomaly rather than the perpetrator of a sordid affair. He typed out a response, his fingers moving with a detachment that frightened him. I'm reading the articles, Jess. It's a lot to process. I just need time to get my head around the science of it. Don't push me. He hit send, hating the lie but knowing it was necessary bait. He needed her calm, he needed her hopeful. If she thought he was wavering, if she believed her gaslighting was taking root in his shock-addled brain, she would stay put. She would remain in the penthouse, waiting for him to return as the benevolent, gullible savior she clearly thought he was. He set the phone down, the deception leaving a sour taste in his mouth, and turned his gaze back to the city skyline, waiting for the signal from Nia. Across the city, in the sleek, gallery-like interior of the Wrights' townhouse, a different kind of game was being played. Nia moved through the space with the silent grace of a predator, her senses tuned to the frequency of her husband's arrogance. Marcus was home, lounging on the Italian leather sofa like a king resting after a conquest, a glass of vintage Bordeaux balanced precariously on his chest. He was in high spirits, buoyed by a recent merger and the mistaken belief that his domestic life was a stable platform for his ambitions. He had no idea that the woman pouring him a second glass of wine was currently orchestrating his annihilation. You seem tense, babe, Marcus said, accepting the glass without looking away from the oversized television screen. His voice was rich, confident, the voice of a man who has never been told no. Nia smiled, a thin, brittle expression that didn't reach her eyes. Just inventory stress, she lied smoothly, settling into the armchair opposite him. The new installation is proving difficult. She watched him sip the wine, noting the way he dismissed her concerns with a vague nod. He was so sure of her, so convinced of his own centrality in her world, that he couldn't see the knife until it was buried in his ribs. It was this hubris, she knew, that would be his undoing. Marcus shifted, the tablet he used for everything, work, investments, and his secret life, sliding from his lap to the cushion beside him. He stretched, groaning with the satisfaction of a man whose body is his temple, and announced he was going to take a shower. "Don't wait up," he added with a wink that made Nia's stomach turn. "I might do some reading in bed." He stood up, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over the room, and sauntered toward the master bedroom. Nia waited. She counted his steps, listened for the heavy thud of the bedroom door, the sound of the lock clicking, habit, not suspicion, and finally, the distant hiss of the shower. She moved instantly. The moment the water started running, she was off the chair and reaching for the tablet. Her hands were steady, fueled by an adrenaline that felt like ice water in her veins. She knew his passcode. He had never changed it because he assumed she had no interest in the dry world of his finance apps. But she wasn't looking for spreadsheets. She sat at the kitchen island, the device flat on the marble, and plugged in the small flash drive she had purchased with cash 2 days ago. The recovery software Liam had sourced for her was sophisticated, designed to dig through the digital sediment of a device and pull up the ghosts of deleted files. The progress bar crawled across the screen, an agonizingly slow green line that seemed to mock her urgency. Nia glanced toward the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. If he came out now, if he forgot a towel or just decided to check his email, the charade would be over. She could hear the shower running, a steady, masking white noise, but every creak of the floorboards upstairs sounded like a footstep. The software pinged softly, too loud in the quiet kitchen, and a list of files populated the screen. Videos. Photos. Chat logs. Marcus had deleted them from the gallery, but he hadn't scrubbed the drive. He was lazy with his secrets. She didn't watch them there. She didn't have the time or the stomach for it. She simply dragged the entire folder onto the drive, watching the transfer rate with breathless intensity. 1 minute. 40 seconds. The shower stopped. Nia froze, her finger hovering over the drive. She heard the bathroom door open, the heavy tread of bare feet on the carpet. Nia. Marcus's voice boomed from the top of the stairs. "Did you see my charger?" She yanked the drive out, slid the tablet back onto the sofa cushion, and smoothed her dress. "It's on the sideboard," she called back, her voice steady. "I'm just making tea." The drive burned a hole in her pocket as she took a cab to the hotel an hour later. Liam was waiting for her, the door to the suite already open before she even knocked. He looked worse than he had the day before, his eyes rimmed with red, his skin possessing a gray, unhealthy pallor. He didn't ask if she had it, he just stepped aside to let her in. They moved to the desk, bypassing the bed that had been the site of their desperate connection the previous night. This wasn't about passion now. This was about evidence. Nia plugged the drive into Liam's laptop, her hand brushing his, and they both stared at the screen as the thumbnails loaded. There were dozens of files, a digital archive of infidelity that spanned over a year. But one video file, dated 6 months prior, stood out. It was longer than the others, and the timestamp indicated it was recorded in the middle of a workday. Liam clicked on it. The screen filled with the grainy, high-contrast image of a steam-filled room. Tiled walls. The roar of water. It was a shower stall, likely in the executive gym Marcus frequented. The camera angle suggested the phone had been propped up on a shelf, hidden behind a towel, recording as if it were an audience to a private play. Marcus and Jessica stepped into the frame. They were naked, slick with water and steam, their bodies intertwined. But it wasn't the nudity that made Liam recoil, it was the way they looked at each other. There was a familiarity, a comfortable arrogance in their touches. Jessica laughed, throwing her head back, the sound echoing sharply off the tiles. "God, you're insane," she said, her voice dripping with a kind of admiration Liam had never heard directed at himself. She ran her hands over Marcus's chest, contrasting her pale fingers against his dark skin, creating the visual that had tormented Liam since the hospital. "You love it," Marcus said, his voice deep and reverberating over the sound of the water. He spun her around, pressing her against the wet tiles. "Tell me you don't love this. Tell me I'm not better than that stiff you married." Jessica moaned, a sound of genuine pleasure that twisted like a knife in Liam's gut. "It's different," she gasped. "It's raw. You have this wild energy he just doesn't have. Liam is so structured. So careful. So boringly white." She giggled at the phrase, as if it were a harmless joke, unaware that she was dismantling her husband's masculinity for the amusement of her lover. Liam watched, his face devoid of expression, but Nia could feel the heat radiating from him. The video continued. Marcus turned Jessica to face him, a smirk playing on his lips. "So what happens when the kid comes?" he asked, his tone casual, as if discussing a dinner reservation. "You think he's going to buy it?" Jessica rolled her eyes, a gesture of dismissal that was terrifying in its cruelty. "Please." Liam sees what he wants to see. He's so desperate to be the perfect modern husband. He'll probably thank me for adding some diversity to the bloodline. Marcus laughed, a loud, booming sound that distorted the microphone. "That's my girl," he said. "Let him pay for the private schools. Let him pay for the college. He's the perfect wallet, Jess. White men like him, they're too polite to ask questions. They're so terrified of being called racist they'll raise another man's son just to prove how progressive they are." He leaned in, whispering something into her ear that made her shriek with laughter. "We breed M, he feeds M. That's the deal, right?" The video ended with them engaging in an act so raw and dismissive of their spouses that Nia had to look away. But Liam did not look away. He watched until the screen went black, absorbing every word, every insult, every pixel of the betrayal. The silence that followed was absolute. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the city in a suspended state of quiet. Liam sat perfectly still, the laptop screen reflecting in his eyes. The cruelty of it was absolute. It wasn't just that they had cheated, it was the specific nature of their contempt. They had weaponized his decency. They had used his race, his nature, his very kindness as a tool to cuckold him. "Reverse racism," Liam whispered, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "They made me into a caricature. A wallet. A joke." He looked at Nia, and the pain in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a terrifying, flat calm. "He thinks I'm weak because I'm white. She thinks I'm boring because I'm safe." He stood up slowly, walking to the window to look out at the city that Marcus and Jessica thought they owned. "They think they're the predators," he said softly. "They think we're the prey because we played by the rules." Nia walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. She felt the tension in his muscles, coiled tight like a spring about to snap. "They underestimated us," she said, her voice fierce. "Both of us. Marcus thinks I'm just a trophy to hang on his arm, someone to make him look cultured. He doesn't think I have the brain to outmaneuver him." She looked at the reflection of them in the glass, the dark queen and the pale king, united by a hatred that burned brighter than any love they had ever known. "We have everything we need now, Liam. This video, it's a death sentence for them in court." Liam turned from the window. His face was pale, but it wasn't the pallor of shock anymore, it was the color of marble, cold and hard. "Court?" he asked, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping his lips. "Yes, we'll go to court. We'll take the money. We'll take the houses. But that's not enough." He walked back to the laptop and closed it with a gentle, definitive click. "They wanted to make us into a joke. They wanted to humiliate us based on stereotypes. I don't just want a divorce, Nia. I want a public execution." He began to pace, the plan forming in his mind with architectural precision. Jessica thinks she's protecting a miracle. Marcus thinks he's untouchable. We're going to let them believe that. We're going to let them walk into the courtroom thinking they're the smartest people in the room. He looked at Nia, his eyes burning with a cold blue fire. "And then we are going to play this video. Not just to the judge. To everyone. We put it into the public record. We make sure that everyone they know, their clients, their families, their friends, sees exactly who they are." Nia shivered, not from fear, but from a dark, thrilling anticipation. She had wanted justice, but Liam was offering something far more satisfying. He was offering retribution. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Marcus prides himself on his image," she said. "If this gets out, he loses everything. His reputation. His clients. His ego." She smiled, and it was a dangerous, predatory thing. "I love it." "The last drop of pity is gone," Liam said, looking down at their joined hands. I spent 3 days wondering if I did something wrong. If I wasn't enough. But they didn't do this because of who I am. They did it because of who they are. He squeezed her hand tight. They want wild energy. Fine. I'll show them wild. I'll burn their entire world down, and I won't even raise my voice to do it. They stood there in the silence of the hotel room, two people forged into weapons by the fire of betrayal. The video on the drive sat like a grenade on the desk, waiting for the pin to be pulled. Liam looked at Nia, really looked at her, and realized that in this wreckage, he had found the one thing Jessica had never given him, a true equal. Get the rest of the files, he said, his voice steady and commanding. We build the case. We secure the assets. And when the court date comes, we don't just win. We annihilate them. Nia nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears of rage and relief. Consider it done, she whispered. She leaned in and kissed him, a hard, bruising kiss that tasted of salt and victory. Let's go to war, Liam. As they pulled apart, the city lights outside seemed to flicker, as if acknowledging the shift in power. The victims were dead. The Avengers had just been born. The courtroom was less a hall of justice and more a theater of cruelty, its mahogany paneling and high ceilings designed to amplify the drama unfolding within. The air conditioner hummed with a low, persistent drone, fighting a losing battle against the stifling heat of bodies packed into the public gallery. Word had spread, as scandal always does in high society, and the benches were filled with the curious elite, their faces composed into masks of solemnity that barely concealed their hunger for ruin. Liam sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid, his hands clasped on the polished wood surface. He wore a suit of dark navy, chosen by Nia for its severity, and his face was a smooth, impenetrable stone wall. He did not look at the gallery, he did not look at the reporters sketching furiously in the back row. His gaze was fixed on a point in the middle distance, conserving his energy for the demolition that was about to begin. Across the aisle, Jessica was putting on the performance of her life. She had dressed for the role of the martyr with meticulous care, wearing a modest cream-colored dress that hinted at vulnerability without sacrificing elegance. Her hair was pulled back in a loose, slightly messy bun, suggesting a mother too overwhelmed by grief and new responsibility to care for her appearance. She kept her head bowed, dabbing occasionally at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, a prop that seemed lifted from a Victorian melodrama. To the casual observer, she was the picture of a woman scorned, a new mother abandoned by a heartless husband who could not look past the color of a child's skin. It was a tableau of innocence that made Liam's stomach churn with a mixture of nausea and cold, hard rage. Her attorney, a man named Mr. Sterling who wore three-piece suits and a perpetual sneer, rose to deliver his opening statement. He prowled the space before the bench like a shark scenting blood in the water. His argument was predictable, vicious, and terrifyingly effective in the current political climate. He painted Liam not as a victim of infidelity, but as a man governed by archaic, racist prejudices. He spoke of implicit bias and financial coercion, weaving a narrative where Jessica's infidelity was a cry for help and Liam's refusal to pay alimony was an act of bigotry. He argued that Liam had stepped into the role of father during the pregnancy and was now discarding a helpless infant solely because she did not meet his genetic aesthetic. Your Honor, Sterling intoned, his voice dripping with righteous indignation, we are not denying the biological reality. We are denying Mr. Hunt's right to abandon his moral and financial obligations based on an immutable characteristic of this innocent child. To strip this mother of support because her child is black is not just a breach of contract, it is a violation of human decency. The gallery murmured, a ripple of unsettled agreement moving through the room. It was a dirty tactic, weaponizing the very real issue of racism to shield a fraudster, and for a terrifying moment, Liam saw the narrative taking hold. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the court reporter, the uncomfortable shifting of the bailiff. They were winning. Presiding over this farce was Judge Holloway, a man in his late 60s with skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that had seen every lie New York City had to offer. He sat behind the bench with the stillness of a statue, his face unreadable as he listened to Sterling's grandstanding. He did not take notes, he simply watched, his gaze flicking occasionally from the weeping Jessica to the stoic Liam. There was a tension in his jaw, a tightness that Sterling likely interpreted as sympathy for the abandoned child. Liam knew better. He knew that Holloway was a man of the law, but he also knew that the accusation of racism was a bell that, once rung, could not be unrung without overwhelming evidence. When it was time for the defense, Liam's lawyer, a woman named Ms. Vance whose sharpness rivaled a scalpel, stood up. She did not offer a counter-speech. She did not argue about feelings or moral obligations. She simply stated that the defense called a single witness to the stand, Mrs. Nia Wright. The name caused a stir in the courtroom. Heads turned, necks craned, and a hush fell over the gallery as the heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. Marcus, who had been sitting in the back row under a subpoena he clearly resented, stiffened in his seat. He had expected his wife to be at home, weeping over his betrayal, not walking into the lion's den. Nia entered the room like a storm front. She was not dressed in the somber colors of a grieving wife. She wore a tailored suit of electric blue that seemed to vibrate against the wood tones of the court, her hair styled in intricate, regal braids that crowned her head. She walked with a cadence that commanded attention, her heels clicking a steady, martial rhythm on the parquet floor. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Liam. She looked straight ahead at the judge, her expression one of terrifying serenity. As she passed the defense table, Jessica looked up, and for the first time, the mask of the victim slipped, revealing a flash of genuine confusion and fear. Nia took the stand, swearing the oath with a clear, unwavering voice. When Ms. Vance asked her relation to the case, Nia's eyes flicked briefly to Marcus, freezing him in place, before she answered. "I am the wife of the biological father, Marcus Wright." The admission hung in the air, stripping away the polite euphemisms Sterling had used. Ms. Vance walked to the center of the room. "Mrs. Wright, you claim to have evidence regarding the nature of the relationship between the plaintiff's wife and your husband. Is that correct?" Nia nodded. "I do. I have digital correspondence and video files recovered from my husband's personal cloud storage." Ms. Vance approached the bench, holding a small, silver flash drive as if it were a holy relic. "Your Honor, we submit this drive as Exhibit A. It contains video footage dated 6 months prior to the birth of the child, recorded by Mr. Wright himself." Sterling jumped up to object, citing privacy and relevance, his voice rising in panic. But Judge Holloway silenced him with a single, sharp gesture of his hand. "If this goes to the intent and the nature of the marital contract, Mr. Sterling, it is relevant." Overruled. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who took the drive and plugged it into the court's AV system. A large screen on the side wall flickered to life. The room went deadly silent. The static of the speakers hissed for a second before the sound of rushing water filled the courtroom. Then, the image resolved. It was the shower scene. Grainy, high contrast, and undeniably intimate. Jessica and Marcus appeared on the screen, larger than life, their nakedness shocking in the formal setting of the court. But it wasn't the nudity that made the gallery gasp, it was the laughter. It was the casual, mocking tone of their voices echoing off the high ceilings. "Tell me I'm not better than that stiff you married," Marcus's recorded voice boomed, dripping with arrogance. Jessica sat frozen at her table, her face draining of blood until she looked like a wax figure. On the screen, her digital avatar laughed, a sound that was cruel and sharp. "Liam is so structured. So careful. So boringly white." The words hit the courtroom like physical slaps. Sterling sank into his chair, realizing that his racism defense was currently being dismantled by his own client's voice. But it got worse. The conversation shifted to the pregnancy, and the true nature of their plan was laid bare for the world to see. "You think he's going to buy it?" Marcus asked on screen. Jessica's reply was a death knell for her case. "Liam sees what he wants to see. He's so desperate to be the perfect modern husband. He'll probably thank me for adding some diversity to the bloodline." The gasps from the gallery were audible now. The cynical manipulation of Liam's progressive values, the calculated use of his race against him, was exposed in high definition. It was reverse racism of the most insidious kind, a fetishization of stereotypes used to defraud a spouse. Then came the line that sealed their fate. Marcus's voice, loud and distorted, filled the room. "He's the perfect wallet, Jess. White men like him, they're too polite to ask questions. They're so terrified of being called racist they'll raise another man's son just to prove how progressive they are. We breed M, he feeds M." The vulgarity of the phrase hung in the air long after the video cut to black. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. No one moved. No one breathed. The victim narrative had been nuked from orbit. Judge Holloway turned his chair slowly to face the defense table. His expression was no longer unreadable. It was a mask of profound, simmering disgust. As a black man who had likely spent his life fighting actual prejudice, seeing these two privileged narcissists use the specter of racism as a cover for their greed and lust clearly offended him on a visceral level. He looked at Jessica, who had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking not with performed grief, but with the realization of total ruin. Then he looked at Marcus in the back of the room, whose arrogant facade had crumbled into a look of sheer terror. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Holloway said, his voice quiet and dangerous. "Do you have any context that could possibly explain what this court has just witnessed? Any context that justifies the accusation of racism you leveled against the plaintiff?" Sterling stood up, opened his mouth, and closed it again. He looked at his client, then back at the judge. "No, Your Honor," he whispered, effectively resigning from the fight. "I have no further questions." He sat down, distancing himself physically from Jessica on the bench. The judge turned back to the courtroom. "In 30 years on the bench," he began, his voice resonating with authority, "I have seen many things. I have seen greed. I have seen betrayal. But rarely have I seen such a cynical, calculated attempt to weaponize the court's commitment to equality for the purpose of fraud." He picked up his gavel, holding it suspended for a moment like the sword of Damocles. "The argument that Mr. Hunt's refusal to support this child is based on racial prejudice is not only dismissed, it is found to be a malicious fabrication by the defense. The court finds that the defendant, Jessica Hunt, entered into a conspiracy to commit paternity fraud," Holloway continued, his words hammering down like nails in a coffin. "As such, the prenuptial agreement is voided in its entirety on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. There will be no alimony. There will be no division of assets. The plaintiff, Mr. Hunt, retains full ownership of the marital home and all associated accounts." Jessica let out a sob, a real one this time, a sound of pure despair, but the judge was not finished. "Furthermore," the judge said, his eyes locking onto Marcus in the back row, "the court acknowledges the presence of the biological father, Mr. Marcus Wright. Since Mrs. Hunt is currently unemployed and without assets due to this ruling, and since Mr. Hunt has no biological or legal tie to the child, the court orders immediate paternity testing to formalize custody arrangements." He paused, letting the weight of the sentence land. "Mr. Wright, you expressed a desire to breed them. The court expects you to feed them. You will be hearing from the state regarding child support and custody obligations immediately." Marcus looked as if he had been shot. He slumped in his seat, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that didn't exist. He looked toward the witness stand, toward his wife, pleading silently for help. Nia stood there, looking down at him from the elevated platform. She did not look angry. She did not look sad. She looked victorious. She held his gaze for a long second, letting him see the cold indifference in her eyes, before she turned to the judge and nodded respectfully. She had just destroyed his life using the evidence of his own ego. "Case closed," Holloway said, banging the gavel with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. "Court is adjourned." The spell broke. The gallery erupted into a buzz of whispers and frantic typing as reporters rushed to file their stories. Liam sat still for a moment, letting the adrenaline wash out of his system. He felt lightheaded, almost dizzy with the sudden release of months of tension. He looked across the aisle. Jessica was arguing frantically with Sterling, who was packing his briefcase with the speed of a man fleeing a sinking ship. She looked small, broken, and utterly alone. Liam stood up, buttoning his jacket with steady hands. He turned to the witness stand, where Nia was stepping down. She walked toward him, the crowd parting for her as if she were royalty. When she reached him, she didn't smile. She didn't need to. The look that passed between them was one of profound, shared satisfaction. They had done it. They had taken the narrative back. They had turned the stereotypes and the arrogance of their spouses into the very instruments of their demise. As they walked out of the courtroom together, leaving the wreckage of their marriages behind them, Liam felt a hand grab his sleeve. It was Marcus. He had pushed his way to the front, his face sweaty and desperate. "Nia," he choked out, ignoring Liam entirely. "Baby, please. You have to understand. It was just a game. It didn't mean anything. We can fix this. He reached for her, his hand trembling. Nia stopped, looking at his hand on her arm as if it were a piece of trash that had blown onto her suit. She carefully removed his hand with 2 fingers, stepping back to stand closer to Liam. "You're right, Marcus," she said, her voice smooth and cool as glass. "It was a game. And you lost." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document, slapping it against his chest. "You'll be served formally tomorrow, but I thought I'd save the process server a trip. Those are divorce papers. I'm keeping the gallery. I'm keeping the brownstone. And thanks to your little video, I have all the proof I need of financial misconduct to ensure I keep everything else too." Marcus stood there, holding the papers, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. He looked from Nia to Liam, and for the first time, he truly saw them. He saw the unity, the strength, and the utter lack of fear. He realized too late that the weak, white man and the demanding, black wife were formidable enemies when aligned. Liam stepped forward, towering over the broken man not in height, but in presence. "Good luck with the kid, Marcus," Liam said softly. "I hear private schools are expensive." He turned and offered his arm to Nia. She took it, her grip firm and warm. They walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding afternoon sun, leaving the sobbing Jessica and the stunned Marcus in the shadows of the lobby. The air outside tasted sweet, clean, and full of infinite possibility. The nightmare was over. The reckoning was complete. And as Liam looked at the woman beside him, dazzling in the sunlight, he knew that the best part of his life was just beginning. 6 months later, the sun was setting over the Hudson River, painting the sky in streaks of bruised violet and burnt orange. It was a different view from the penthouse, less panoramic but infinitely more grounded. Liam stood on the balcony of the brownstone he had purchased in Brooklyn, a structure of warm brick and ivy that felt alive in a way the glass tower never had. The air here smelled of damp earth from the garden below and the salty tang of the river, a complex, organic scent that suited his new life. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, listening to the distant hum of traffic, feeling a profound sense of stillness that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with peace. The jagged edges of his life had been sanded down, smoothed by time and the steady, rhythmic presence of the woman who was currently walking through the French doors behind him. Nia moved with the silent grace of a cat, her bare feet making no sound on the decking. She didn't speak immediately, she simply stepped up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. The weight of her against his back was a grounding anchor, a physical reminder that he was no longer drifting untethered in a sea of betrayal. He covered her hands with his own, looking down at the contrast of their skin tones in the fading light. 6 months ago, that contrast had been a source of pain, a visual marker of how they had been wronged. Now, it was just them, a harmonious interplay of light and shadow, 2 distinct elements that had forged something stronger than steel in the fire of their shared trauma. Their union had risen from the ashes of 2 catastrophic marriages, but it wasn't defined by them anymore. The early days of frantic plotting and trauma bonding had evolved into a deep, abiding partnership. They were no longer conspirators, they were builders. Nia's gallery was thriving, her exhibitions drawing international acclaim now that she was free from Marcus's stifling, ego-driven influence. Liam had left the large firm to start his own boutique practice, focusing on restoration and sustainable design, rediscovering the joy of creating spaces that breathed. They fit together not because they were broken shards, but because they had healed into shapes that complemented one another perfectly. The ghosts of their past lives had been exorcised, banished to the periphery of their existence where they served as cautionary tales rather than active threats. Jessica and Marcus had vanished from their daily reality, transforming into urban legends of greed and hubris whispered about at cocktail parties. The last Liam had heard, Marcus was working as a junior analyst at a third-tier firm in Jersey City, his assets liquidated to pay legal fees and the court-mandated child support that bled him dry every month. His arrogance had been his shield, and Nia had stripped it from him, leaving him exposed and mediocre. Jessica's fall had been even more precipitous. The social circles she had cultivated so carefully had closed ranks against her, repelled by the sheer scale of her deception. She was living in a small apartment in Queens, waiting tables to make ends meet, raising a daughter alone because the biological father wanted nothing to do with the living proof of his infidelity. It was a harsh, cold existence, a far cry from the nursery with the hand-painted walls and the future she had tried to steal. Liam felt no pity, only a distant, clinical detachment. Justice had been served, not by divine intervention, but by the ruthless application of truth. The sudden, jarring buzz of the intercom cut through the evening air, startling a pair of pigeons from the railing. It was an aggressive sound, insistent and out of place in the tranquility of the evening. Liam felt Nia tense against his back, her arms tightening slightly around him. "Are you expecting anyone?" she murmured, her voice low and wary. Liam shook his head. They had no guests scheduled, their evenings were sacred, guarded fiercely against intrusion. He gently disengaged from her embrace, setting his glass on the railing, and walked back into the living room toward the wall-mounted security screen. The camera feed flickered to life, revealing the small, distorted vestibule downstairs. Rain had begun to fall, slicking the streets with a dark sheen, and huddled in the doorway was a figure that looked both familiar and utterly alien. It was Jessica. She was soaking wet, her hair plastered to her skull in rat-tailed strands, her expensive coat, likely one of the few things she had kept, stained and heavy with water. She looked aged, the stress of the last half-year etched into the lines around her mouth and the hollows of her eyes. She wasn't holding the baby, she was alone, shivering under the harsh LED light of the security camera. Liam stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the talk button. He felt nothing. No surge of anger, no pang of lost love, not even the satisfaction of seeing her brought low. He just felt a mild annoyance at the interruption. Nia had come to stand beside him, looking at the screen with a dispassionate gaze. "She looks desperate," Nia said, stating a fact rather than an opinion. "She is," Liam replied. He pressed the button, his voice calm and flat as it traveled through the wire to the speaker downstairs. "What do you want, Jessica?" Jessica flinched as his voice emerged from the speaker, her head snapping up to look at the camera lens. Her eyes were wide and glassy, filled with a frantic, manic energy. "Liam," she choked out, her voice distorted by the rain and the static. "Please. I need to talk to you. Just for 5 minutes. I can't do this anymore. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. But I've realized something. I only ever loved you. Marcus, he was a sickness. A delusion. Please, let me come up. I'm cold." She pressed her hand against the metal frame of the door, a gesture of supplication. "I know I hurt you," she rambled on, the words tumbling out over each other. "I know it looks unforgivable. But we had something real for 5 years. You can't tell me that meant nothing. I can fix this. I can be the wife you wanted. The baby, she's innocent, Liam. She needs a father. You were so ready to be a father. You built that crib. You painted those walls. You have a father's heart. Don't let your pride destroy what we could still have." Liam watched her for a long moment, listening to the rain hiss in the background. Her manipulation was clumsy now, stripped of the elegance and power she used to wield. She was trying to play on his nostalgia, on his perceived weakness, on the very softness she had mocked in the shower with her lover. She still didn't get it. She still thought this was about pride, or anger, or race. She thought he had left her because he was hurt. She had no idea that the foundation of her entire deception had been flawed from the very first moment she decided to lie to him. He leaned closer to the intercom, pressing the button again. "You know, Jess," he said, his voice conversational, almost gentle, "there is something I never told you. A detail that makes this whole tragedy almost comedic." He paused, watching her face on the screen. She had stopped shivering, listening with a desperate hope, thinking he was opening a door to reconciliation. "You keep talking about how you fooled me. About how I believed the lie for 9 months. But the funniest part of this story isn't that you cheated on me with a black man. The funniest part," Liam continued, his voice hardening into diamond-edged clarity, "is that I'm infertile. Sterile. I have been since I was 20 years old. I had mumps as a child, a severe case with complications. Orchitis. It killed any chance I had of fathering a child naturally. I knew it before I ever met you." Jessica's face on the screen went slack, her mouth opening in a silent O of shock. The hope vanished, replaced by a dawning horror as the implications began to cascade through her mind. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid," Liam admitted, the truth flowing out of him easily now. I was afraid you would leave me if you knew I couldn't give you the perfect family you wanted. I was insecure. But then you came to me, glowing, holding that pregnancy test, telling me we had made a miracle. He laughed, a short, sharp sound. I knew the second you showed me that stick that you were a whore. I didn't need a private investigator. I didn't need a confession. I knew with absolute, 100% scientific certainty that you had betrayed me. But I didn't say anything, he went on, his voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. I waited. I watched you lie to my face every single morning. I watched your belly grow with another man's child. And do you know why I waited, Jessica? Because I was curious. If the baby had come out white, I would have had to run a DNA test to catch you. It would have been messy. Expensive. Hard to prove without a fight. So I waited to see the color. Liam delivered the final blow. I waited to see if you and your lover would make it easy for me. And you did. You made it so easy. You handed me the gun and the bullets and stood in front of the target. I just had to wait for the delivery room to pull the trigger. So, thank you for that. Thank you for saving me the cost of a paternity test. Jessica staggered back as if he had physically struck her. She stared at the camera, her face a mask of absolute devastation. The narrative she had built, that she had tricked him, that he was the gullible fool, shattered. He had been playing her the entire time. He had watched her act out her charade, knowing the ending before the curtain even rose. The power dynamic flipped so violently it left her breathless. She wasn't the manipulator, she was the mark. Go home, Jessica, Liam said, his tone final. Go back to Queens. Go back to the life you built with your choices. You don't have a husband here. You never really did. He released the button, severing the connection. He watched for a second longer as she slumped against the brickwork, sliding down into the puddles, weeping into her hands. Then he reached out and turned the monitor off. The screen went black, erasing her from his home and his life for the last time. The silence in the living room was profound. Liam stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet air, feeling the last tether to his old life snap and dissolve. He turned around. Nia was standing where he had left her, leaning against the doorframe leading to the balcony. She was watching him with an unreadable expression, her arms crossed over her chest. He wondered for a second if the cruelty of his revelation had shocked her, if he had shown her a side of himself that was too cold, too calculating. But then her face softened, and a slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. She walked toward him, her hips swaying with that confident rhythm he had come to adore. She didn't ask why he hadn't told her sooner. She didn't judge him for the long game he had played. She understood. She understood that survival sometimes required weapons that polite society deemed unacceptable. She stopped in front of him, reaching up to cup his face in her warm hands, her thumbs tracing the line of his jaw. You played the long game, she whispered, admiration coloring her tone. You let them dig their own graves. Liam nodded, leaning into her touch. It was the only way to be sure, he said. The only way to be free. Nia pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with a tenderness that promised a future devoid of lies. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with a new idea, a path forward that didn't rely on biology or deception. You know, she said softly, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, biology is overrated. It's just plumbing. Family is about intention. It's about choice. She paused, searching his eyes to make sure he was ready to hear it. There are so many children who need a father, Liam. A real father. Someone who builds cribs with his own hands and teaches them how to plane wood. We could adopt. We could choose a child. Any child. Any color. It wouldn't matter to us. Liam felt a lump form in his throat, a sudden swell of emotion that caught him off guard. The pain of his infertility, a secret shame he had carried for a decade, suddenly felt lighter, diminished by her acceptance. She wasn't asking him to fix it, she was offering a different way to build. Any color, he repeated, a smile touching his lips for the first time that evening. Our world is big enough for that now. Exactly, Nia whispered, kissing him again. Our world is whatever we make it. She took his hand and led him back toward the balcony, away from the darkened monitor and the rainy street. They stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights twinkling in the distance like a promise. Below them, the garden smelled of rain and new growth. Liam looked at the woman beside him, his partner, his equal, and realized that the perfect life he had lost was nothing compared to the real one he had found. The past was a closed book. The future was a blank canvas, and for the first time in his life, he was holding the brush.